Part 1. The Silent Power of the Wounded Soul. We begin not in light, but in a strange, aching darkness, the kind that grows inside the soul of someone who has spent their life absorbing pain that wasn't theirs. You, the empath, know this darkness well. It's the invisible room where you've spent years forgiving, explaining, and justifying the behaviors of those who hurt you. You've confused love with endurance, thinking that if you just loved harder, they would finally see you, respect you, change. But they rarely do, and the more you give, the more they take, until one day, something inside you simply breaks. That moment when the empath stops forgiving is not a collapse. It is a rebirth. It is the emergence of something ancient and powerful that had been buried beneath politeness, fear, and self-erasure. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." What makes this terrifying is that when you finally accept your worth, your limits, and your truth, you can no longer remain in relationships that survive on your silence. You see, the world has taught you that empathy is endless, that it's your job to always understand, always hold space, always give another chance. But empathy without boundaries is self-destruction in slow motion. You become a sponge for other people's dysfunction, believing that your capacity to love will somehow cleanse them of their shadows. Yet, as Jung warned, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. You've been imagining light in people who were never willing to face their darkness, and in doing so, you've been blind to your own. So what happens when you stop forgiving? When you stop explaining away cruelty as trauma? When you stop romanticizing potential and start seeing people for who they are, not who you wish they could be. That is the moment every mask around you begins to fall. The charming narcissist, the manipulative friend, the emotionally unavailable partner, they all begin to unravel because they no longer have your forgiveness as their shield. This is not about becoming hard or bitter. It's about becoming whole. You are not discarding your empathy, you are refining it. You are no longer offering it to those who exploit it. You are reclaiming your energy, your time, and your soul. And the people who only knew how to feed off your light will panic not because you changed, but because you finally remembered who you are.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Think about how many times you've said, "They didn't mean it." How often you convinced yourself, "They're just going through something." And how many nights you cried over people who slept peacefully, unaware or indifferent to the damage they caused. You weren't weak. You were hoping. You were trying to love someone into healing, but healing is a door they have to choose to walk through themselves. Jung's concept of the shadow is not just about others, it's about you. You, too, have a shadow, the part of you that's angry, tired, and done being walked on. You've been conditioned to suppress it, to stay nice, to avoid confrontation. But that shadow is not evil. It is your protector. It is the force within you that says, "I will not betray myself for the comfort of others." When the empath stops forgiving, the real transformation begins. You stop being a mirror for other people's projections and start becoming a mirror for truth. You stop absorbing and start reflecting. And people who thrived off your compliance will accuse you of changing. But what they call change is actually you stepping into your authenticity, and that terrifies them. Ask yourself this: who are you when you are no longer defined by your ability to absorb pain? When you no longer need to be the peacemaker, the fixer, the emotional sponge, what remains? That question is not meant to frighten you, but to awaken you. Because beneath the roles you've played is a self that has been waiting to breathe, not in service to others, but in service to truth. This is individuation, the process Jung described as becoming whole. It is not about becoming perfect. It is about integrating all parts of yourself, the light and the shadow, the softness and the fire. You are no longer trying to be good in the eyes of others. You are trying to be real in the eyes of your soul. And that shift changes everything. The moment you stop forgiving without accountability, the illusion collapses. You begin to see clearly who respects your boundaries and who only respected your willingness to have none. You see who loved you and who loved your usefulness. And that clarity, though painful, is freedom. It is the beginning of a life where your empathy is no longer a liability, but a sacred, protected gift. You were not born to be an emotional landfill. You were not created to carry the weight of people who refuse to carry themselves. Your empathy is a superpower, but only when it is rooted in discernment. Love is not unconditional when it costs you your dignity. Compassion is not spiritual if it enables abuse. So let me ask you a deeper question. Can you bear being misunderstood in order to be truly free? Because when you stop forgiving, some people will call you cold. They will call you selfish. They will say you've changed. But the truth is, you're just no longer playing the role they designed for you. There is a power in walking away, not out of hate, but out of love for yourself. There is a sacredness in silence, not to punish, but to protect your peace. And there is a liberation in saying, I will no longer bleed for those who cut me. That is not cruelty. That is clarity. The empath who always forgives teaches others that their behavior has no consequences. But the empath who draws a line teaches others that love has standards. That kindness is not infinite. That even the softest hearts have limits. That even angels have boundaries. When you stop forgiving, you stop participating in your own destruction. When you stop forgiving, you stop rewriting the same painful story. And when you stop forgiving, you start writing a new one where your needs matter, your voice is heard, and your soul is finally safe. You are not here to save everyone. You are here to awaken. And sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is walk away. Part 2. The collapse of illusions and the birth of boundaries. Something strange happens when the empath finally stops forgiving. The people who once seemed magnetic, charming, even divine, begin to lose their glow. You start to notice things you were too blind or too loving to see before. The subtle manipulation, the passive-aggressive remarks, the way they always made you feel like you were the problem. At first, this realization is disorienting, but then it becomes liberating. Carl Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And this is exactly what many people do when faced with the empath's silence. They scramble. They project. They gaslight. Because your forgiveness was their escape from accountability. And now that it's gone, they have no choice but to meet themselves raw, unmasked, and unfiltered. This is when the roles reverse. You, the one who was always seen as the soft one, become the mirror. You expose truth not by attacking, but by no longer playing the game. You don't need to scream. You don't need to threaten. Your absence speaks louder than your words ever could. And suddenly, the personas around you start to crack. Narcissists, manipulators, and energy vampires thrive in the presence of someone who never says no. Your kindness, your understanding, your compassion, it was the perfect environment for their emotional parasitism. But when you stop forgiving, you remove the oxygen from their performance. You pull back the curtain on the play. And what's left is often ugly, insecure, and terrified of being seen. This is not about revenge. It's about revelation. You're no longer trying to fix broken people who benefit from staying broken. You're no longer feeding the illusion that love means sacrifice without end. You're stepping into your adult self, the self that knows love without self-respect is not love at all, but emotional servitude. And that shift changes the entire dynamic. Jung often wrote about the persona, the mask we wear to adapt to society. But he also warned, the persona is only a mask for the collective psyche, a mask that feigns individuality. When the empath stops forgiving, what they're really doing is withdrawing from the collective game. They are no longer playing the role of the good one, the peacekeeper, or the healer. They're choosing truth over performance. And the moment you choose truth, you become dangerous, not in the sense of harm, but in the sense of clarity. You can no longer be manipulated. You can no longer be guilted into staying. You can no longer be shamed into silence. Because you now understand that your empathy is not a leash. It's a blade. And when wielded with awareness, it can cut through every lie you've ever been told about what it means to love. Let's reflect on a hard truth. How many of your relationships were built on the unspoken rule that you would always be the one to forgive first? That you would never leave, never challenge, never make things uncomfortable? That you would absorb, adapt, suppress? And when you finally didn't, when you finally said enough, what happened? You may have noticed a sudden shift. The same people who called you too sensitive suddenly accused you of being cold. The ones who praised your kindness now criticize your boundaries. This is because your change exposed their comfort. They were comfortable with your silence, comfortable with your emotional labor, comfortable with you playing small so they could feel big. But you're not small anymore. You've stepped into the light of your own consciousness. You've stopped forgiving not because you're bitter, but because you're awake. You see the patterns, you see the cycles, and most importantly, you see yourself not as a reflection of others' needs, but as a sovereign being with needs of your own. Jung said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. This is the essence of your awakening. You've sat with your pain, you faced your wounds, you've acknowledged your own shadow. And now you have the wisdom to discern the difference between someone who is struggling and someone who is using their struggle as a weapon. There is a profound stillness that comes when you stop over-explaining your boundaries. You no longer feel the need to justify your distance. You understand now that not every battle deserves your presence, and not every apology deserves your acceptance. Forgiveness is powerful, yes, but it is not owed. Especially when it becomes a cycle of enabling. So allow yourself to grieve what you once believed. The belief that love could save everyone. The belief that people would change if you just held on a little longer. The belief that your worth was tied to your ability to endure. These illusions are heavy, and letting them go will feel like a death, but it's also the beginning of your resurrection. Ask yourself this: what parts of yourself did you hide in order to keep the peace? What truths did you swallow because you were afraid they would leave? What dreams did you delay because you were too busy carrying someone else's pain? These questions are not meant to shame you. They are meant to return you to yourself. Because you were never meant to be a background character in someone else's story. You were never meant to be the emotional reservoir for people who refuse to dig their own well. You were meant to be whole. Not perfect, but whole. And wholeness requires boundaries. Wholeness requires discernment. Wholeness requires saying no even when it breaks your heart. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from someone who keeps wounding you. Sometimes the greatest act of compassion is choosing yourself. You might lose people. In fact, you will. But you won't lose anything real. You'll lose the illusions. You'll lose the roles you were forced into. You'll lose the version of yourself that was never truly you. And what you'll gain is something sacred: peace, clarity, and alignment with your truth. This is not the end of your empathy. It is the evolution of it. Empathy without awareness is martyrdom. Empathy with awareness is power. You are no longer the empath who forgives out of fear. You are the empath who forgives wisely and who also knows when not to. So I'll ask you again, can you bear the loneliness that sometimes comes with choosing yourself? Can you withstand the silence that follows walking away from those you once lived for? Can you trust that this path, though narrow, leads to something deeper than comfort? Because once you do, you will never go back. You will never again betray yourself for belonging. You will never again dim your light to make others comfortable. You will never again offer your heart to those who treat it like a convenience. When the empath stops forgiving, every mask falls and what remains is truth. Uncomfortable, raw, liberating. Part 3. The Awakening of the Inner Guardian. There comes a moment when the empath, once ruled by emotion and hope, becomes something else entirely. Not colder, not crueler, but clearer. In this clarity, a new self emerges, one no longer enslaved by guilt, manipulation, or the endless cycle of second chances. When the empath stops forgiving, they do not become less loving. They become more discerning. They become their own guardian. Carl Jung said, "What you resist persists." For years, you may have resisted your own anger, your boundaries, your intuition. You told yourself that love should always be patient, always kind. But what happens when kindness becomes self-neglect? What happens when patience becomes permission for abuse? You begin to realize that forgiveness, when given without accountability, becomes a form of self-betrayal. This realization is not gentle, it shakes you. Because it forces you to confront the truth about not just others, but yourself. You were not just a victim of their behavior, you were a participant in the illusion. You believed that if you just held on, just gave more, just forgave again, things would change. But they didn't, because love alone does not fix dysfunction. Awareness does. Accountability does. And sometimes distance does. In this new stage, you begin to feel the weight of your own silence, all the times you didn't speak up, didn't say no, didn't walk away. Not because you were weak, but because you were loyal. Because you believed in their potential more than they believed in themselves. But now, you're seeing that loving someone's potential is not love. It's fantasy, and fantasy will always betray the soul. This is when your empathy transforms. It becomes fierce, protective, sacred. You no longer offer it blindly. You no longer allow it to be drained by those who refuse to grow. You begin to realize that empathy without wisdom is a trap, and you refuse to fall into it again. Jung warned us, every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism. And you now see how addicted you were to the idealism of love, of healing, of being the one who could save them. But you can't save someone who is committed to their mask. You can't reach someone who is allergic to truth. And you can't love someone into becoming who they refuse to be. That's not love. That's martyrdom. And you are not here to die on someone else's emotional battlefield. So, what do you do now? You build boundaries, not as walls, but as gates. You decide who enters, who stays, and who must leave. You no longer make excuses for red flags. You no longer confuse chemistry with compatibility. You understand that love without respect is a poison, and you've stopped drinking it. You also begin to recover pieces of yourself you didn't realize were missing. The dreams you postponed, the passions you buried, the confidence you gave away. You begin to feel what it means to be your own person, not someone else's emotional caretaker. And that is where true healing begins, not in fixing others, but in returning to yourself. This return is not immediate. It's a process. You will feel guilt. You will question yourself. You will wonder if you've become heartless. But that's just the residue of old conditioning, the echo of a past where your worth was measured by your ability to endure mistreatment. Let it pass. Let it dissolve. Because what's growing in its place is something far more powerful, self-respect. Ask yourself now, what does love feel like when it's rooted in freedom, not fear? What does connection look like when it's mutual, not one-sided? What does forgiveness mean when it's earned, not expected? These are the questions that reshape your reality. And as you begin to live by them, your entire world shifts. You will attract different people. People who don't fear your boundaries, but honor them. People who don't drain your energy, but contribute to it. People who see your empathy not as a weakness to exploit, but a treasure to protect. And you'll start to realize that the people who left when you stopped forgiving were never really with you. They were with your tolerance, your silence, your emotional labor. Jung spoke often about the self, the unified, integrated being that emerges when we confront our shadow and embrace our light. And this is your initiation into that self. You are no longer the fragmented empath, torn between love and self-preservation. You are now a whole being, capable of deep love, yes, but also capable of fierce protection, especially for yourself. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop over-caring. It means you stop carrying burdens that aren't yours. It means you stop bleeding for people who wouldn't even offer you a bandage. That's not cruelty. That's wisdom. That's survival. That's growth. And still the world may not understand you. They may say you've changed. They may call you distant or selfish. But you will know the truth. You didn't change. You evolved. You didn't close your heart. You just stopped handing it to those who never knew how to hold it. So now, here's the final, deepest question. Can you love yourself more than the idea of being loved by others? Can you stay true to yourself even when it's lonely, even when it's misunderstood, even when you long for connection? Because that, more than anything, is the test of your awakening. When the empath stops forgiving, they don't become cold. They become conscious. They become grounded. They become aligned with something higher than approval. They become aligned with truth. And in that truth, they find peace. Not the peace of being liked, but the peace of being whole. This is your new path, not as the savior, not as the fixer, but as the sovereign. You walk not to save others, but to save yourself. You speak not to soothe the others, but to honor your voice. And you love not to be needed, but to be known. The masks have fallen. The illusions are gone. What remains is you raw, radiant, and finally free. The empath has stopped forgiving, and in doing so, they have remembered who they truly are.